ES6 modules and destructuring are two new features introduced in JavaScript. In this lecture, we'll be learning both of these. It's important to know that these two features are completely independent of each other. You can use either feature without the other. With that being said, it's actually common practice to use these two features together. We will be exploring how that's done. To start things off, I want you to create a file named functions.js. In previous lectures, we would load modules using the require function. For Node, this was perfectly fine. However, we want to use this code on the browser. Using the require function is the common JS method of loading modules. This is perfectly acceptable for Node modules, but I want these files to load on the front where common JS modules are not supported natively. ES6 modules are the official way to load modules in JavaScript. Creating and using modules is fairly easy. We'll just have to do things differently. Let's start with the functions file. This file will be a module for the index file. I'm going to create a constant named hello that will be set to an arrow function. The arrow function will just console.log a simple message. To export a module in the style of ES6, we will have to use the export default keywords. Right after this, we have to specify what we want to export. I want to export the hello constant. With ES6 modules, you can export multiple values. To export a value, you just need to use the export keyword. You can actually just use the export keyword by itself, but if we were to remove the default keyword, then we would get an error. I want to explain why, but it's kind of hard to explain without learning about what destructuring is first. For now, let's pretend you can only export one value, and to export that value, you need both the export and default keywords. In this example, we're going to pretend that we can only export this hello function. This is all you need to do in order to export a module. Let's learn how to import this module. Go back to the index file. I'm going to input the following. Import functions from /function.js. Let me break down what's going on here. To import a module, you need to use the import keyword. This keyword actually does two things. It will import a module and give you the opportunity to assign the module a variable name. I'll expand more on this in just a moment. The next thing that you need to do is specify where that module can be found. Use the keyword from to let JavaScript know you want to specify the path to the module. To specify a path relative to this module, you have to use the // followed by the name of the module. In this case, it would be the functions file. This one line of code will import the module. Then you can just use it normally. If we did everything correctly, then we should be able to run the npm run start command without any errors. Let's test this by opening the index.html file and checking the console. You should see the message being outputted. This is a very basic example on how to export and import modules. When it comes to exporting modules, you will most likely be writing this kind of syntax 90% of the time. However, for importing modules, the syntax will vary. I want to go more in depth into that, but we first need to learn what destructuring is. Destructuring is a very simple concept to understand and use. Destructuring allows you to extract properties from objects and arrays into their own standalone variables. Let's look at an example. I'm going to insert this code right below here. I'm going to create a variable named obj, and this will be an object with two properties called prop1 and prop2. I'm going to set prop1 to 5 and prop2 to 10. Now I'm going to log prop2. To access a property, you have to specify the object and then follow it up with the property name. However, doing it like this can get rather annoying. In a regular application, you may end up having dozens of objects, and it would be annoying to have to constantly type each object and its property. This also makes your code less readable and gives it a nested feeling. Before we had destructuring, you would usually do something like this. You would create a variable and assign its value to the property. That's fine and all, but it can become increasingly annoying each time you had to do this. This is where destructuring comes into play. To destructure a variable, you need to do the following. You can use any of the variable keywords and then follow it up with a pair of curly brackets. By adding these curly brackets, you're telling JavaScript you want to grab properties and put them into their own variable. You simply pass in the name of the properties, which are prop1 and prop2. You have the option of destructuring all the properties or just a select few. The next thing you need to specify is which object where these properties can be found, which is obj. This line of code does the same thing as the line above it does. I'm going to comment out the traditional way of doing this. Then I'm going to update my log function to use the prop2 variable rather than accessing the obj variable. Run the npm run start command. You shouldn't receive any errors. Check out the index template to see if the number 10 is being outputted. By itself, this really isn't impressive. This is a super simple feature. It was introduced because it makes you write less code, and I would say it's more or less readable than the previous method. I'm going to comment this out. While destructuring can be used by itself, you will usually see it used with importing modules. I'm going to go back to my functions file and I'm going to export a variable named num with a value of 5. We will no longer pretend that we can only export one thing. To export multiple pieces of data, you can just use the export keyword followed by the name and the value. I'm going to stop right there. JavaScript requires that you export a name and value. If we were to just export the number 5 by itself, then we would get an error. You are expected to export a name and value pair. You cannot just export a value, and you cannot just export a name. If I were to restore this and remove the number 5 this time, then I would get an error from Webpack. This is super important to understand. I have to pass in a name and a value. This is why you would get an error if you were to just export the hello function without the default keyword. You are only giving value, but you're not giving it a name. JavaScript doesn't care that you define the variable above. You have to give it a name and value on the same line. So what does the default keyword do then? The default keyword allows you to give a default exported value. You are allowed to export multiple values. Since you can export multiple values, then you also have the option of importing all those values or some of those values or just one of those values. Inside the import statement, you can specify what value you'd like to import. In this example, we're actually not specifying any particular data. Even though we have a hello function inside the functions file, this line will not grab the hello function. Instead, it'll grab the default value. With that being said, I don't have to name this hello inside my import statement. This is just a reference. Since it's a reference, I can change this to whatever name I want. I can change this to foo, and then I can update my code to reflect that change, and this would still work. This line is saying, hey, I want to import some code from the functions files. I'm not specifying any particular data, so give me whatever the default export value is. I want you to assign the value returned to a variable named foo. To prove this further, I'm going to run the npm run start command. I didn't receive any errors. Then I'm going to view the page again. You should see the message still being outputted like before. Even though you can name the imported value whatever you want, it's common practice to name it after the value that's being exported so it can be easier to understand. I'm going to change my values back to hello. The question is, how do we import specific values from a module? This is where destructuring comes into play. I'm going to change my hello to a pair of curly brackets. What will happen is that JavaScript will return an object. Each property in that object will be each value you exported. You can use destructuring to grab a certain value. I want to grab my num value. What this will do is extract that num value and make it into its own variable. We can then log this variable like so. I'm going to run the npm run start command. There should be no errors thus far. The number 5 should be outputted onto the page. Let's say I wanted to give my imported value a custom name. That's relatively easy. All you have to do is use the as keyword and then follow it up with a custom name. Then you can use this custom name throughout your code like so. I'm not a fan of custom names, so I'm going to remove this. Let's say I wanted to import both the default value and another value. There are two ways you can go about this. The first way is by using the asterisk character and then assigning this to a custom name using the as keyword. I'm going to set this to functions. What this will do is grab all the exported values and assign them as properties to the functions variable. You can then access the values by their names like so. If you want to grab the default value, then that is stored under the default property. Of course, this does mean you will end up writing more code, which isn't what we want. The second method of getting the value is to just comma separate it. Right before the destructuring, I'm going to just add hello. Keep in mind that by not using destructuring, you won't have the ability to specify what value you want to use. So JavaScript will just assign this to the default value. Now you can use both the hello function and num variable by themselves without having to access it from an object. There are a couple more things I want to cover. You do not have to export a default value. You can just export the hello function without assigning it to the default. I'm going to get rid of the default keyword. I cannot simply leave it like this. I have to set a name and a value. So I have to move this function into the export statement for this to work. I'll now have to update my import statement. I have to use destructuring since there is no default value. Let's see what happens if I were to not use destructuring and try to call the hello function. I'm going to run my npm run start command. Webpack will throw an error stating that there is no default value. In order for this to work, we have to use destructuring. I'm going to add my curly brackets back in and run the command again. Then I'm going to view my page. As expected, this will output the message. There are a couple more things we can go over, but this is just the basics. I know it can seem overwhelming because you can use this in a number of combinations. I promise you we will get a lot of practice using this as it's extremely common to use ES6 modules and destructuring. For the most part, you won't have to worry about using a lot of the trickier parts of modules or destructuring. We're going to keep it really simple and just export some default values. The examples I show you are super simple, but I assure you that these features are extremely helpful in more advanced apps. For now, let's move on to the next lecture and learn about React.